Healing trauma is an act of leadership. That's something I believe strongly in, and I certainly think it's relevant to the conversation around mental health and entrepreneurship. Because by default, entrepreneurs are leaders. So today is going to get pretty granular. I'm for sure going to look at my notes, but I want to talk about that phrase, healing trauma is an act of leadership, what I mean by that, and then what it looks like in our daily lives and what we can expect as a result of living by that axiom. My name is Lauren Fritsch. I have started a video series around mental health and entrepreneurship. And today, healing trauma is an act of leadership. This phrase is important to me because it's one that I believe firmly could guide our collective humanity to a better place. I'm going to be really getting nitty-gritty with the words I use and defining them so that we can all play on the same page. And I would love to hear how this information lands with you. So please feel free to leave a comment below. I received a lot of DMs after my first video. So I know that the concepts of mental health and speaking about experiences in the public eye is really important. And so today's is really about the nuts and bolts of what does it mean to be a leader, and what does it mean to be a leader healing one's own trauma, and what are the implications in the grander landscape. So the reason I believe that healing trauma is an act of leadership is because when we take responsibility for how our bodies and our minds respond to stimuli in our environment, when we take responsibility for those responses, then we are actively practicing self-leadership. And that self-leadership has an unbelievable ripple effect on the micro, our immediate environment, and on the macro, right? The collective. So, again, I just said a lot of things that I want to make sure I tease out. So let's start with two words. I want to start with trauma, and then I want to go with leadership. What do I mean by trauma? It's a word that's bandied about a lot. And subsequently, I'll talk about the word trigger too, because people love to misuse that word. Trauma is any experience either that you are an active participant in or that you are witnessing, that your body, your central nervous system cannot parse and process and then return back to baseline after. And when I mean baseline, I mean your basic normal functioning. Okay, I'm going about my day, I'm good, right? Good. But when something traumatic happens, it could be a car accident. It could be emotional, physical, verbal, sexual abuse, assault. It could be witnessing something like that. It can be, frankly, experiencing a news cycle about something traumatic. There are so many different variations of trauma for different people that I cannot sit here and tell you what is going to be traumatic to you, just the same way you cannot sit here and look at me and say, oh, this is going to be traumatic, and that's not. Okay? It's the death of loved ones. It's the illness of loved ones. It's one's own health. It's being repeatedly ignored, gaslit. That goes back to the emotional abuse. It is living within a system that is abusive. There are so many different kinds of trauma that humans are engaging with on a regular basis. And fortunately, we have these brilliant, beautiful systems that help us titrate trauma so that we can continue to function and continue to live and continue to procreate and continue to take care of ourselves and our families and then work towards the dreams that we have, right? But what happens when we start to get too much trauma in our personal systems can no longer parse stimuli in an effective way. So that means when a stimulus comes that is not an earthquake or an assault, when a stimulus comes and our central nervous system can't calm back down, it's because we can't parse that is not an actual threat. It feels like a threat. And our body responds as if it's a threat. So when we have a system of trauma getting activated, and there are a lot of people who talk about this way more brilliantly than I could ever hope to, but so if you want to dig into the nature of trauma and the vagaries of trauma, please do that. But for the purposes of our discussion today, everybody's got some trauma. It could even just be childbirth, right? Like coming out the birth canal is traumatic, okay? And we all basically came out vaginas or a womb, okay? Also traumatic. So we all came out of our moms. That's traumatic. We are living in a system that has created oppression and dualism. That's traumatic. We've just endured and are continuing to endure unnecessary deaths. We're getting bombarded by media messages every day that are traumatic. Today happens to be a day when the news cycle is full of the Indigenous children who were found, their bodies found in a mass grave in Canada. Traumatic. So let's just go with a baseline that we all got trauma. Now, what do we do with that? And what does that have to do with leadership? So, you see how I define trauma? Everybody's got it. Leadership. What is leadership? So, you're not going to skate out of this one either. Everybody's a leader, but let me define it a little bit so we can be clear. A leader is someone who takes resources and marshals them together in the direction of a shared goal. So you might be the leader of your business if you're an entrepreneur, for sure you are. You might be the leader of a volunteer group. You might be the leader of a family. You might be the leader, de facto leader of a friends group. For sure, based on that definition, everyone is the leader of herself. So you are marshaling the resources at hand to achieve something in this life. And self-leadership is just as / maybe more important than the leadership of others, right? And if we cannot effectively lead the self, then we cannot effectively lead others. And we've seen that happen and play out in our world. So everybody's got trauma to heal, and everybody's got a role as a leader just by virtue of being on this planet. So if I'm saying that healing our own trauma is an act of leadership, then it's also an exhortation and an invitation for everyone to be on that path. That's a lot. It's a lot to put on people, right? Especially if we have no support. So let's talk more about it. I want to talk about like the specific. When we experience a stimulus that triggers our inherent trauma, something that's already happened, we can go to a place that is familiar and comfortable, that is our conditioned response to trauma and to a stimulus that mimics that trauma. What I'm saying is that the process of healing requires us to say, nah, I'm not going to go down that neuronal pathway, the one that I always go down, the one that has the deeper grooves. I am going to make a new neuronal pathway over here. Much easier said than done. But that's what we're asking people to do when we talk about healing trauma. It's not, oh, let's heal and then we're done. No, it's healing. I said this in the last video. It's healing. It's not healed. It's healing because we're constantly doing it. It is living in this crazy pants world and getting a barrage of stimuli that could send us off the deep end into a different direction, where we deepen the groove of past trauma. We deepen the grooves of conditioned responses. Or we just make a little turn and go off in a new groove, right? That is what I'm talking about when I say we are going to heal our trauma as leaders of the self. And that healing our trauma is an act of leadership, because we're saying, I am not content to live with my knee-jerk reactions. I know that there is a different and better choice that I can make. Now, I do want to just say there's a caveat, and I've been in this place in time when the system is so hijacked, when the grooves of neuronal synapses are so deep that there is no place, there's no room to create a response. It is just immediate every single time. And so that's when you get into the really tough, the tough experience of PTSD specifically, and CPTSD, when the stimulus comes and the reaction is instantaneous within milliseconds, right? And it's that jittery, ragey, heart racing kind of reaction that many of us who have experienced those situations, that you feel, even though oh, I'm at the mall, there's a man there, he feels threatening, my body is freaking out, even though he's just sitting there eating his ice cream because he happens to look like a perpetrator, right? So I will say this, even though healing our trauma is an act of leadership, there are times when we cannot find a way to respond before the reaction, the cascade of stress hormones and cortisol and adrenaline has already started in our bodies. So we will talk about that instantaneous reaction another time. But when I'm speaking about the invitation to consider your own healing process as an act of leadership for self and for others, it is saying there is going to be available to me at some point another way besides this conditioned response. And that is what I'm reaching for over and over and over again. So, when we take responsibility for healing, what does it look like in practice? I want to speak to that. And I've got my trusty legal pad here, and it really helps me. It's just the self-awareness of like, oh, I'm doing that thing again that I always do. This is a conditioned response. It's not who I am. So the self-awareness piece. The next one is inquiry, like what's going on here? Why does this keep happening? It's important to be that curious kind of scientist. There is the point where we make an active choice to do something different. Next time I will, and equip ourselves with resources so that next time we can do something different. And then there is the practicing and the reinforcement of the new pattern, right? Now, all of those are available to someone when your system isn't hijacked. The time to do all that is not when you are in a heightened emotional or central nervous system state. So, a tiny example of this is how many of us have a relationship with a certain person, and it could be in the workplace, it could be personally, that when you see that person's name come in on communication, could be email, could be text, could be, a DM, you immediately are on edge. That is a perfect example of a very small, but that's a trauma response. Something is going on there that has triggered a stimulus that has triggered a central nervous system reaction, right? So I'm not saying that you're never going to experience a charge, an emotional charge. Well, that would be boring, right? Who wants that life? But ideally, we as leaders of the self and leaders of others we are going to get to a point where we're going to be less flappable, less reactive. And when we are reactive, we go immediately to the, oh, isn't that interesting? I'm aware. Oh, what's underneath of this? Why am I responding this way? What do I believe about this person or this situation? Okay, I want to do this differently. Here's what I'm going to do differently. And now I'm going to practice so that I have that groove set out and I can just go in that groove instead of the other one. So that's a very small example of how, as a leader, one can respond differently, choose differently, act against conditioning. And I have here a major example. I'm going to skip it for today because I just don't want to go there. Okay? Because I'm a little emotionally fragile today. I don't want to talk about that subject. And it was more of a major example of a bigger trauma, if you will, and then how that can play out in triggers and stimuli in daily life. I'm not going to go there. Now, when we have leaders of our world who have unhealed trauma responses, I'm laughing. It's not funny, but it is. We see what happens when they get triggered. Immediately. They sling words. They start wars. They slap sanctions. They do things from a conditioned response to trauma instead of from a place of higher knowing and a calm central nervous system. Earlier today, my husband and I talked about a business decision. I was feeling frustrated about something and I want to make an investment in something else. And I said, but I am emotional today. I don't want to make that decision while I'm in this state. I wish that our leaders were actively leading themselves before they pursued leadership positions. I wish they were actively healing their own traumas before they were pursuing leadership positions, because if that were the case, we would get better leaders. We would get better leadership. We would get better legislation. We would have better diplomacy. Healing our own trauma is an act of leadership. Let's see what else I have. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is break the cycle of initial trauma, then begets a reactivity to triggers. So then triggers can come. Then we have more reaction, and that actually creates more trauma. So it's a very vicious cycle. And I am asking us to consider that as one of the most important aspects of our role as leaders, is breaking that cycle. And the impact of trauma is intense. So I have some stats here. I'm just going to read from my paper. It says that in 2013, we had an estimated $238 billion spent on mental health, except that only 5% of that total $238 billion actually goes to mental health treatment. So what it means is that 95% of the money is used for things other than treating behavioral health problems. Having a mental health diagnosis, so on the spectrum of trauma, getting to the point where the trauma is so intense that there are other changes in the brain and the body, most of that cost is actually physical cost, the cost for our body's medical care. That's how expensive trauma is. It is a public health crisis. And I can speak to that. When my PTSD was so intense, I had chronic bronchitis and couldn't really function. It was so bad. I was like wheezing all the time, and I was so exhausted. It was hard to parent. And that's just one physical manifestation. I also, and this is very, vanity, but my skin took a huge hit. It got all crepey and thin, and it was fascinating to me to see the physical manifestation of trauma on my body. So the cost of trauma is massive. And I'm not going to say that it's preventable. We will never prevent all traumas, right? We live in a chaotic world. But how much of the re-traumatization is preventable? So much. Gosh, I feel like everyone I know has worked in a traumatic workplace, a toxic workplace. And on a macro level, we need more leaders who are healing themselves. People like, Prince Harry. I'm going to speak about him and his wife a lot because they're really modeling something beautifully. He's showing us in front of our eyes, in front of the media, what it looks like to confront his triggers. So he has spoken explicitly about how every time he heard the press pack, their shutters clicking, the cameras, he would immediately go back to being in his mom's car as a child and being chased down. He would immediately go to his mother's death and the aftermath of that. And so he's talking about what it takes to confront one's triggers, to create and maintain healthy boundaries with himself, with the press, with his family of origin, and then sharing the reality of that process after the fact so that others can follow it and use it as a model. So he's also using his platform to amplify the voices of other people and their lived experience of dealing with and then healing trauma. So when we have leaders who do this, it's incredibly, incredibly valuable. And that is, again, that's on the macro, but it starts with us on the micro. I don't know if I've got more to say. Probably do. Okay. I think I'm going to dig into that later. It's a little bit more about the toxic workplace and entrepreneurship as an antidote. But that is for another video. So, if nothing else from today, I want to leave you with the invitation to consider the powerful implications that healing actively one's own trauma has. Those implications have on our small little world, the world right around us, and then the ripple effect they will continue to have everywhere we go. This is really small, but I'm going to speak to it because I think it's important to me. So I am a survivor of rape, and I've had a stalker. I've experienced a peeping Tom, not cool. And I've gotten really angry that men think that my body is for their pleasure against my will. And so one day, while I was very early in the healing process, I was walking down the street in Midtown Manhattan, and I had just been to acupuncture, where I would go very regularly to get my trauma points done, because acupuncture was part of my healing process. And this big, probably Irish guy, he was like at least 6'7", construction worker, looked me up and down and then said something. I don't recall what he said, or maybe I didn't even hear in the first place. I have no idea. But he looked at me like I was such a piece of meat. It was so objectifying. And I was just like wearing a fucking raincoat, okay? And some jeans and some tennis shoes. And This guy looked at me like he just wanted to eat me. And I was triggered, like massively. And I started hollering at this guy, yelling, "You need to be a gentleman. Who do you think you are to treat me this way? I am a human." And one of his coworkers, another guy, is like, because I kept walking. I believe I also used some choice words, but another guy was like, "Hey, I mean, don't you think you look pretty today?" I was like, "Of course I think I look beautiful today. That has nothing to do with it. This is about treating people with decency and humanity." Oh, I ripped, and this guy was like, "Oh my gosh." And he was like, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry on, I apologize for my coworker." And I'm not sorry I got triggered, because those guys needed to hear what it felt like to be treated in such a way. What they do is not okay. Regardless of what I was wearing. I don't care if I was wearing a short, tight dress and a low-cut top and had my butt out. Like, don't care. It doesn't matter. I am not asking for someone to objectify me as I walk to the subway. What is really interesting is that threw me, because my system was not even to a point of healing where I could process that well. I was really on edge for the rest of the day. I broke down in tears when I got home. Just the other day, I was walking down the street. I have no idea what I was wearing, some sundress. It had sleeves. Jesus Christ. And a kid, young kid, whistled at me. And I was going to go and pick up something. And on my way back, because he was the security person for a store right where my car was parked, I went up to him, and this was all in Spanish, and I don't even know if it communicated because I'm not fluent in Spanish yet. And I was like, "Listen, thank you for the compliment, but next time, if you want to compliment me, do it in a way that acknowledges that I'm a human, not a piece of meat. Think about your sister. Think about your grandmother. Think about your mother." I mean, never mind that I'm like at least twice as old as this kid. But what's amazing is the crux of the message is not different. It's relate to me as a human. That's all I'm asking, instead of as an object. But the difference is that we could enter a dialogue because I wasn't triggered. Because I could choose at this point, with this much distance, with this much work done on my healing, I could choose a different neuronal pathway. It feels very different to operate in this way. And for a long time, that was not available to me, because my system had not yet recalibrated post-trauma. So if your system is not there yet, don't worry. I'm not demanding that of you, right? I have some other things to say on other videos, right? But is there a place where, when the trigger happens, when the stimulus comes, that you can choose a low stakes situation and choose a different pathway? That's what actively being part of healing our own trauma as leaders looks like. And that's what we as leaders are called to do on a daily basis. It is hard to opt out of conditioning. That's why people just keep doing the same thing over and over again. We can do this. You can do this. I love you. All right.